Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 78, we sit down with Susan Townsend Johnson, a resident of Greenport. With a deep connection to the town's history, Susan shares stories of her rich ancestry, including her family's ownership of the Townsend Manor, and offers a vivid portrait of what Greenport was like in early times, along with the challenges that shaped the community. We explore her path to social work, a journey sparked by her experience in school, and discuss why she ultimately chose to return to Greenport later in life. Susan also reflects on her brother, Joe Townsend's historic role as the youngest mayor of Greenport and the transformative changes he brought to the village. We conclude with her thoughts on the present state of Greenport and her hopes for its future. So I hope you enjoy episode 78 with Susan Townsend Johnson. This episode was recorded June 27th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm looking forward to our chat.
I am too. Thank you for letting me be on.
Absolutely. So, to start off, can you give us a little introduction about yourself, where you were born and raised?
My name is Susan Townsend Johnson. I was born in New York City because my mother's father was a very prominent OBGYN, and she didn't trust the Eastern Long Island Hospital. So she had all of her children in New York. And for my late sister and myself, that was a lifesaver because we were both born with umbilical cords around our neck, and we needed to be in an incubator for a while, and there were no incubators out here at that time. That was June 2nd, 1942. My grandfather, the doctor, was the first person to perform a C-section with anesthesia out here.
Wow.
And he'd been performing them in New York, but not with anesthesia.
That's your grandfather?
That is my mother's father. His name was Franklin Dorman. Mm-hmm. He delivered the grandchildren of Mark Twain and Thomas Edison and a few more other famous people.
Wow, that's incredible.
He was an incredible man. I never knew him personally, but my mother talked so much about him that I had a lot of love for him through her. He died when she was only 18 because he worked 24 hours a day. Mm-hmm. And so he had 2 massive heart attacks in his late 50s.
Now, in terms of your ancestry, how far back, say, can you go on your mom's side?
My mom's side is a lot more vague because I grew up in Greenport and I heard a lot about my relatives out here. And my mother was a great storyteller, so I heard about her grandmothers, and her grandmother on her mother's side was in New Jersey, Montclair, New Jersey, and her grandmother on her father's side was in Massachusetts. That was the Dorman line. And so I heard about Uncle Willie, who was a calendar, and Uncle Harry and Uncle Tom, who were Dormans. And they kind of got mixed up. My grandfather Dorman, the doctor, built a huge summer home in Orient, and it overlooked both the bay and the sound. That home he built so that his brother, who was living in Lebanon and teaching in the American University could come back with all of his family to stay there for the summer. Mm-hmm. So there would be 13 children in that house.
Wow.
And 4 adults. And of course, they all brought servants because that was the day when you could. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So many. I got to stop here because I have so many things I can tell you about that house. So let's get back. My father's family I know a great deal about. One, he was related to the Corwins, the Cooks, and the Townsends. Now, my grandfather Townsend was a gentleman farmer up in Oyster Bay. He was a part of the Quaker meeting house up there. And he was getting older and he wanted to marry. And somehow he met my father's aunt. Her name was Mina Cook. And he decided to marry her. She was a pillar. Her family were pillars of the Methodist Church in town. So she would not leave Greenport. So he moved out here. And he married Mina first. Mina had a daughter, my Aunt Hetty, and Hannibal she was. And her mother died when she developed childbirth fever, and she lived about 18 months after the birth. Mm-hmm. And then a couple of years after that, he married her sister, Lillian Cook Townsend, very staunch suffragette, Women's Temperance Christian Union, mm-hmm. daughter of the American Revolution, 6'2". And my grandfather was 5'6". And every picture that we had of them, he's sitting down and she's standing up. And then shortly, within a year of that marriage, my father was born.
Okay.
An aside is that my grandmother was a amazing traveler. So for her honeymoon, she made her husband take her out west by stagecoach. Mm. And they were one of the first guests at the Yellowstone Hotel that was in part of the national park, which had just been opened. Mm-hmm. And he was not well then. She talked about that. He couldn't really enjoy the trip. But she did. And when my brother was emptying out the house, he found her journal about the trip with pictures of the inn. And he made a trip out there to give that to the owners of the Yellowstone Inn. Mm. So it was, they were very grateful to see it. She was one of the first guests. Anyway, the other interesting thing about those two, my grandmother and my aunt, who was married to her husband first, when Mina and Joe were married, they went to the World's Fair. I guess it was in Buffalo at that point, and they witnessed McKinley being assassinated.
Wow!
And my brother we didn't know this. My brother found the newspaper article in the attic of the house that we were selling. Amazing. Yeah. So I was. And the other there were very many famous Corwins, and I have a lot of information about them because I have two cousins, who were related to me through the Dormans and the Corwins. And their grandfather was Fred Corwin, who was the publisher of the Suffolk Times. And he had so many records. They found them all. They sent me so much stuff. All of the deeds. Well, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Charles Langdon Corwin, was a major builder out here. Fred, his grandson, had saved all of the deeds and titles to the property that he bought to build houses and buildings on. Mm-hmm. And it's now in the Sterling Historical Society. Mm-hmm. He built the auditorium, the Methodist Church, the Holy Trinity Church and Hall, and many more. But many private homes that are no longer here. But the Claudio House, which is on the corner of Broad Street and First Street, mm-hmm. on the north side, mm-hmm. he built that for his daughter Anna. And when they were renovating it, they found things in the walls, advertisements for the building company, circuses, carnivals, mm. and they were, the other information I got was from, and I'm not sure how she probably was related to me through the Cook side. Her name was May Hartley. She lived out here. She was a single woman. I don't know what she did. She may have been a clerical worker, mm-hmm. but she wrote a book about her grandmother, who was Charles Langdon Corwin's sister, and she married an itinerant preacher and quote unquote went out west to Indiana. And in the book, initially she traveled by stagecoach, then the train came, and then the Erie Canal. And there's all the stories about how she went back so she could see her family. Not very often, but, in the wild west of Indiana.
But did you get to meet some of your grandparents?
Oh, I only knew my grandmothers. My grandfather died when my mother was only 18, and my father's father died when he was 10. He was not a well man.
And did you say what he did?
He was a farmer. He came out here. He sold his family. He bought out his family. His father continued to run with the family there, and I think he did not work after that. I think he lived off that money. Mm-hmm. And when he died, because he was only, my brother was only 10, so that meant that he'd only been out here 12 years. Mm-hmm. And by that time, he was in his early 60s. Yeah. And that's how, so when he died, my grandmother inherited money from him, and she had her own parents. They were Maria and L. Hayward Cook. And Lafayette Hayward Cook, the first, was a clipper ship's captain. He had his own. And my brother found the charter for his boat, for his ship, again in that attic, and that's in the Seaport Museum now. So he sailed in the China trade. So, I knew May Hartley. I did not know her sister. When my father died, her brother, whom I never had met, came to the funeral. And I didn't even know he existed. That's how, I'm not quite sure why that happened, but it did. I never met him until then. Maybe I didn't. I don't remember because I was little. Who knows? But I do remember him coming out of his house when he saw me and expressing his sorrow about my father's death. And he told me who he was.
Mm-hmm. And so on your father's side, it goes very far back on the North Fork.
Well, I don't think on the North Fork, no, but on Long Island, yes.
On Long Island, yes. Okay.
Because his farm was in the Oyster Bay area, and my father took us up to see his grave, to see the family grave and the meeting house. It was a famous Friends meeting house in Oyster Bay, and all of his relatives were buried there. He was buried in Greenport. And there was a very famous place called Raynham Hall, which was the history of the Townsends living in that area. So and I know about the history of the Townsends coming over from England because they were Quakers, and they all ended up. They went to Massachusetts, and they all ended up in Oyster Bay. There were many that ended up elsewhere, but the ones that were closely related to us ended up in Oyster Bay. And I never asked my father how he ever met Mina Cook, because she was in Greenport, but somehow he met her. I'm not sure how it happened.
And how did they make their way out to the North Fork from Oyster Bay?
By carriage, horse and buggy. And in my brother's dining room, and it was sitting in our dining room, and it was in the dining room of the inn, is a beautiful old, huge table, with many leaves. And it was carried on a cart, and the wheel hit the edge. So there's you see where the wheel rubbed away the wood. So my grandmother ended up buying the Townsend Manor Inn from a sea captain within 3 or 4 years of her husband dying. That came with the Adams house, which is they call it the gingerbread house next door. And so her parents lived there. She opened the quote-unquote tea room, but it ended up becoming an inn. And my father, who was about 10, 11, or 12, he was on his own after that. I mean, he went to school, but my mother had his mother had no time for him. And my mother always said that part of his parenting difficulties came from the fact that he had really little contact with his parents. He loved his grandmother and his mother. And when his mother died, and he worked in the business with her, so he got to be closer to her as adults. He wanted to be a stockbroker. He graduated from Yale in 1930. There were no jobs on the stock market.
During the Depression.
Yeah, 1929 crash. And so he tried to find work in New York, but it was very unsatisfactory. And his mother needed his help. So he came out to run the inn with her. And he was already involved with my mother because he had met her at the big property in Orient where all the young people hung out. All college kids. And so they married in 1935, 5 years after he graduated from college. And I know
how did they meet?
At the Dorman property in Orient, because she had 5 siblings. Then they were all her cousins that were all there. So it was the center for all the kids who were in college, who had, more kind of. My father did not have many friends that were educated. And so he had many friends from his Greenport years. He stayed close in touch with them, but they were not the people he socialized with particularly. It was that group of young people out in Orient. They had a tennis court and a beach and gorgeous, beautiful grounds overlooking the water. And my parents were married there on those grounds. And the wedding picture of her veil flying in the air because it was so windy. It was a place where I had enormous happy memories. And so I grew up in Greenport. The things that made me the happiest about Greenport was the nature, the freedom of movement. Once we got old enough to ride our bikes, my mother told us we could go watch what would happen, watch our way. There were hardly any cars in town in those days. I mean, we're talking the early mid to late 40s. And people didn't drive like maniacs on the roads. So we could drive all over the village and go visit our friends, but we were not allowed to go to the beach because she didn't want us to be at the beach without adult supervision. So we'd come home at 3:00, and the dog and all the kids and our friends would pile in her car, and she'd take us out to the beach at that big house in Orient on the Sound. We also had a tennis court. And when nobody was living there to tend it, it was our job to weed, rake, and line the court. And we had this heavyweight roller. 2 of us had to pull it with 2 big wheels. And we were horrible because if anybody came to play on the court and it was wet, we'd go down there and say to them, "Don't you play on that court. We have to roll it." Sometimes it worked, but we were not there all the time. So often we'd come the next day and we'd have to rake and roll because it was clay. It was a clay court.
But even within Greenport, what other activities would you do?
Well, there was the movie house. When I got to be a teenager, there was the roller skating rink. My mother used to just take us on hikes so we could learn about nature. She'd take us to Moore's Woods. First time I ever saw a lady slipper, she told me what it was, and the Jack in the Pulpit. And she would then take us to the beaches, especially at the end of Sound Road, in Greenport with 57 steps. She would take us there, and she'd help us find Indian artifacts. We go jumping over big, boulders, looking down to see if there was anything. I mean, I can remember thinking, "Oh, what a life! Here's the water," and then we got hot. We go swimming. But she grew up in New York, and her summers were in Orient, and she loved this area, which is one of the reasons why she married my father, because she wanted to raise her children in Greenport. And we had I have 3 siblings. We always, we had our spats, but we basically had a good life together and then we had all our friends. And after we left the inn was sold because my father's half-sister, first cousin, was taking money out of when my grandmother died, she left the inn to both of them. But my aunt never put anything into it. She just took out. And my father had 4 young children. And during the winter months, he had to shuck oysters in the oyster factory to survive and support his family. The one thing that helped him during World War II was he built an annex to the inn, which is down by the creek. They call it the cottage now. And that was to billet Navy's sailors during World War II. And he got $3 a night. And he said that was the most money for each sailor, most money he ever earned in the inn. He didn't have to work in the oyster factory during the war because he was taking care of the sailors.
Yeah. And then what year was that they sold the inn?
No. So my father sold the inn to my aunt in 1949. We moved into our home up the street Christmas Eve, 1949. And she hired someone to manage it, and didn't do any overseeing of it, and the place went downhill rapidly. So in 1954, she sold it to the Gonzalez family.
Okay.
And my father loved them. He was an insurance broker, and he had the insurance on the inn. And he was so impressed with what Mr. Gonzalez did. He put in the marina, which made a real difference, and a pool,
yes,
which is still there. Yeah.
And then, was it also challenging? Would it be more that even similar to today, but more of a summer?
Oh, there was nothing in the winter.
Nothing in the winter.
Nothing in the winter. He had to shut the inn down. One of the local people who was also a Yale graduate had gotten him a license as an insurance agent. So he did have a small insurance business, but he couldn't tend to it at all during the summer because he worked from 6 a.m. to midnight. He ran the whole place. I mean, we never saw him unless we went over to the inn. And I have no memory of the winters there at all as a young child. And I think it was because I couldn't go outside. You know, 2 things about the inn that I loved. One, with all the people, they were the same families that came back every year with children. And the other was that when we were very little, my mother thought it would be a good idea to have a lamb in the yard for the children and the guests. And so my father's close friend, Clem Booth, who ran a farm on Mount Beulah Avenue it's for sale now, I just saw, had sheep. So every spring he would give us a lamb, which we would take care of during the summer and give back. And there was a wonderful artist named Reginald Groom who stayed at the inn every year. Turned out he was the head of the art department at the University of Cincinnati, and I didn't know that then. I found out later. He painted a picture of the lamb, which was in my sister's bedroom for years. I don't even know where it is now, but and also the painting of the inn that I have was one that Reginald Groom painted. I meant to take a photograph to show you. It's a little different from what it is now.
Yeah.
but my memory, the other thing was that many of the dog, the retrievers, they had trials out here. So the guests would come with these wooden station wagons, and they had, Labrador retrievers in there. You can't imagine what that was like for us as children to go sit on the tailgate and play with those dogs. We went to see the trials too. And when later on, when my mother learned about a dog that had been rescued from sea, who was a lab, his name was Rex, and we got him. The fisherman who found him was housing him under a boat in his yard and said to my mother, "You can have him if you want him." So we got dear Rex, and he died at 18.
Oh.
And I was 18 too at the same time when he died. But he those days dogs ran free. There were no packs. They all ran free. There were many black puppies in Greenport, and we knew that they were Rex's offspring. And when he died, we got sympathy notes from all the neighbors, at whose homes he would stop for a treat every day.
That's really nice.
Oh, he was a sweetheart of a dog. Yeah, my brother, when his second to last dog, he named Rex too, and he was a very sweet dog also. My brother had nothing but labs, and they used to be in the office downtown where Delates is, that built right next door. My father had his office there, and so everybody would come just to get a Rex fix and a Nero fix. All his dogs were there. He went to work with them every day. And
also, even say as a child or in your teenage years, would you go into hang out in other businesses or? Well,
of course, the Paradise Suites, which is now Frisky Oyster, was a place everybody went to after school to get fries and Coke. We all hung out there. That was the main shop in town where we went. Then as we got older and the drinking age was 18, everybody went to the tavern, which is now Charlie's Fish Market. The tavern was a bar with a pool table. And I always was a designated driver. So I would have one beer and watch everybody have fun. And then I'd drive everybody home. Because before I got my license, my sisters would drive home. And they didn't care whether they, how much they drank. And my mother was very worried. I can remember her just being really so angry. And I said to myself, when I can drive, I'm going to stop this. Because I never was a big drinker anyway. Mm-hmm. And I can't say that of my sisters.
And now, were you a teenager in the 50s?
Yes, I graduated from high school in 1960. So I entered adolescence in 1950. Well, I was 52, 53.
But even while you were in high school, how did Greenport feel? Because
awful.
Post World War II, it was going awful. Through a hard...
It was very... You heard me. The movie theater, skating rink, tavern.
That's it.
And the Paradise Suites.
Mm-hmm.
And the tavern closed at midnight, but Paradise Suites stayed open until 6 or 7. Mm-hmm. And the winters were horrible. The movie wasn't open. It was open when I was a young child, but it closed when I got to be a teenager. You had to go up to Mattituck, and if you didn't drive, you couldn't go to a movie. But when I was in high school, my mother sent us all the way to private schools. And part of that was because she was so distraught by the way what the education was like for the poor and the socioeconomically deprived kids.
At Greenport High School?
Oh, yeah. And there was a huge number. We had a lot. There was the Black Ghetto, which was 2nd Street. Mm-hmm. They were all shacks.
Yeah.
I had friends of people of color, and they were not as deprived. I mean, but you knew the families that were really destitute, and you knew the families where the kids weren't eating enough and were not properly clothed or dressed. And they got treated like scum in the school. Nobody thought to think about their special needs. The only kids who had special needs were the kids who were obviously mentally retarded or developmentally delayed. But the other kids were thrown into regular classes, no remedial help. The teachers really were horrible to them. There was one instance that I witnessed when I was in the 9th grade where I was in the 8th grade because all of the big black boys stayed in school till they were 16. So that meant they were in the 8th grade for how many years and totally ignored. Nobody helped them. And they were scorned. Well, there was one instance when one of the more, I would say, he was very effeminate, very fey. He started going after one of these black kids, calling him names. And the kid got so angry, he picked him up and threw him down the stairs. And that was horrible. Of course, the kid ended up probably in juvenile detention, and Mr. Tompkins lost his career. I mean, he was very badly injured.
Yeah.
There was another instance where he had a teacher who taught Latin. He was very, he had a club foot, and he was just mean. And he did something to my sister, and my mother would not tolerate that. And I remember her going up and telling him he was never to do that to her daughter or to anybody else. And, you didn't talk that. No teacher talked back to my mother. She was a force of nature. She and her best friend, Mary Tuttle, started the PTA out here. And because of the problems. So after I witnessed that, Mr. Carruthers, who was very badly injured by a student, he'd put a paper spike on his seat, and of course when he sat with. So my mother didn't want us to finish our school years there, so we all went off to a private school.
Wow.
Yeah, that was tough. I mean, it was really those were tough times. But I did have some very good teachers in the 9th grade. My math teacher was Herb Eckert. And my English teacher was Harry Wilson. And when I took my test for the school that I was going to see where I was, what level I was at, they told me I scored better than any other kid because I really had a good background. And so I knew those were good teachers. Anybody else, forget it. The teacher in the 8th grade who taught New York history, he never changed his outline for the course over the years. So the new textbooks were not even coordinated. I couldn't figure out what he was talking about. And I remember certain things, but I know that, that was 8th grade.
Yeah.
I had a science teacher. He was a very short-armed man. Mm-hmm. And he used to use the meter sticks to smack the kids that were down. We sat at a science thing and they were down, right. They were acting up, but I was up in the front and I always was the one who got hit. And it wouldn't feel very good, That was 8th grade science. And when my closest friend, who was one of the brightest girls in school, and I were in the 8th grade, the principal of the school, a man named Mr. Banks, came up and apologized to us for what we were experiencing in school. Yeah. So you can see, things have changed.
Yes.
Big time. Joe explained to me now that one of the reasons that Greenport's school can stay open and is so good is because of all of the people of color and the immigrants, and because they get money to educate them properly from the state.
Mm-hmm. And also, before we move on to you going after high school,
yeah,
I was wondering if you had any other memorable stories that you wanted to share about Greenport.
Well, I can share a little bit about my mother.
Sure.
She was, as I said, a force to reckon with. She knew when people were in need, and she did what she could do to help them. Mm-hmm. She had a wonderful woman who cleaned our home, later the office, and she was struggling. A brilliant black woman who was just struggling. She was in an abusive marriage with a baby. And when my mother hired her to clean the house, she realized right away things were tough. And so she supported her. She helped her get away from her husband. She found work for her in addition to what she was doing she found for Julia in addition to what she was doing for my mother. And she co-signed mortgages, not just for her, but other women. Uh-huh. And there was a gal named Mae Watkins Johnson. She was an elder black woman who died up in a Peconic Landing recently. She got to be over 100. Mm-hmm. My mother sponsored her, supported her going into business as a caterer. And my mother, she catered at my sister's wedding, then at my sister's funeral the year later, and my mother's funeral. And my father's 90th birthday. She was a very successful businesswoman, and my mother helped her get a start. Anyway, when my mother died, there were a number of black women who sent sympathy notes and expressed gratitude for what my mother had done to help them. And my father turned white because she never told him. Mm. And I said, and that's what he said. I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I didn't know that." And she said, "Why would she do that?" And I said, "Because if she'd asked you would have said no." And he would have. He was very anxious about money. It wouldn't have been because they were black. It would have been because he was worried that if they failed, he would really be stuck for the money.
Financially.
Yes. So, bottom line, I looked at him and I said, "Well, she chose the people she knew who wouldn't do that. Did any of them ever fail in paying their mortgage?" And he said, "Never." So that to me, she was a volunteer social worker for the community of color and poverty. She took a lot of kids under her wings. After we left, she did. And every place I go, if they know who I am, they say, "Oh, we loved your mother." She came to our house. She gave us things to do. She fed us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We were growing up. We always wanted our friends to come to dinner. And finally, one day, my mother said, "You know what? I can't feed the neighborhood, and you really can't be so generous with the family food." So I said, "Well, what about if they just came for dessert?" She said, "That's okay." And at 6:00, a whole group of kids would come and sit in the living room waiting for dessert. Yeah. Well, so that's how I knew Greenport. I knew through the kindness of my mother, and through the beauty of nature. I always appreciated that. Mm-hmm. And of course, my family. Even though I went away, I was back every year 4 or 5 times a year. And I would come and do holidays in the family home because I wanted everybody to be together, including my family in Massachusetts. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Now, where did you go to boarding school?
I went to a small Episcopalian girls' school in Garden City, New York, and that was a real eye-opener for me. One, in terms of the closeness and the friendships I had with the other girls, which I had a couple of close friends out here, but nothing like I was living there. So, I saw another world,
Totally different environment.
A totally different environment. First of all, my mother was not one who cared about manners and civility. As long as we were happy and having a good time. Let me tell you, when I waited, I watched carefully because I didn't know anything about, and I got scolded a couple times because I didn't realize. The big thing about the school, you had to stand up when an adult walked in the room. I thought to myself, and I got scolded a number of times. It never occurred to me you stood up.
All these kind of etiquette,
finishing school type stuff. Yeah. It was a very good academic school, but it also, so that was. After that, I referred to my life as a child as being a savage. Very uncivilized.
But overall, the schooling experience was good?
Yes.
What were you kind of interested in terms of like core classes?
Oh, I loved English. I loved languages. I wanted to take more science than was offered. Actually, I ended up in tears when I found out the limited science courses that I could take. I could only take biology there. Mm-hmm. And, my thought had been that my mother had loved and admired my grandfather so much that I thought I might like to be a doctor myself. Turned out that I really had undiagnosed learning issues. Mm-hmm. And especially reading. I could read well, but I couldn't read fast. Mm-hmm. Or I'd lose comprehension. So I spent a lot of nights hiding in the closet trying to get my work done because I couldn't get it done during the regular hours. Mm-hmm. I did love science. I actually really liked math a lot, except for geometry. That was really tough. Mm-hmm. I understood it, but I never, ever did well. Mm-hmm. But no, I had very good teachers there. Excellent teachers there. Yeah, it was really good. Mm-hmm. So then I went to BU. I graduated in 1960, which was the height of the baby boom children going to college. Mm-hmm. And I was applying from Garden City, New York. And the applications were so enormous that even though I was valedictorian, salutatorian of my class, I didn't get accepted at any place but BU. Hmm. Yeah.
And what did you apply? What were you interested in majoring in?
I still wanted to be pre-med. But once I got to college and realized that I didn't have the background in the foundation and I wasn't willing to give up my summers to get it, mm-hmm. I decided I guess I wanted to be a psychologist or a social worker, and that's what I ended up doing. Mm.
And were your parents supportive of you going to college?
My mother was. My father felt that a woman should only go to teacher's college so she have a career, because his mother was a graduate. And remember, she was, back we're talking, he was born in 2007. Mm. So she was in college, she would have been in college before the turn of the century. Yes. There weren't too many options for women then. And the sad thing about what happened, she was teaching when she married my grandfather, and she had to stop teaching because married women were not allowed to teach. Mm. And as a result, when she lost her husband, she could not go back to teaching. Mm-hmm. Not only was she married, she had a child. So that's how she ended up buying the inn. Hmm. In my work as a social worker mm-hmm. in nursing homes, I did a lot of geriatric social work. I discovered many women who had to give up their teaching because they got married. Mm-hmm.
But with what you majored in,
I majored in psychology and biology. I had a double major. And then I went to graduate school in Boston for social work.
What attracted you to social work? Was it linking with your mother?
I realized if I wanted to go into psychology, I would have to take a lot of statistic courses. And there was a lot of statistical research. Mm-hmm. It was very prominent. There was only a small amount in the School of Social Work. They taught you a research course, but much more hands-on clinical education. Mm-hmm. You don't really, you had to get, in order to be able to work as a psychologist, you had to get your PhD.
Yes.
So that was, and I had learning issues and reading issues. I just decided I wasn't going to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I think I made the right. The hardest, I think I did make the right decision because I did do fairly well, but I never earned the kind of income that a psychologist would earn. And when my children were little, my first husband decided he didn't want to be married anymore. So I had to go back to school, work pretty much full time with 2 little ones. And I didn't have anyone to help me. It was really on me. Because my family was out in Greenport, and sadly my mother died just at the same time. So that if she'd been alive, she would have been able to help me a little bit more. My father was not as generous as she was. Although when she died, he talked, and I was going through the divorce, he talked about how he had to make such a life-changing job, when he sold the inn. And what saved him was that he was a very good investor, so that he had enough income to tide us over. We weren't wealthy, but he could afford to. He could afford to fight with my mother over how much money she spent on the children and not have to worry about her not. She would say to him, "Got to take care of your kids."
Yes.
It was much harder for him. But I reminded him that he had one big advantage over me when he did it. He had a wife who took care of the kids. I had to figure out how to take care of my kids.
By yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you ended up staying in Massachusetts.
Right. Well, I met my first husband in graduate school. And he was very ensconced in Massachusetts. And he had a wonderful parents whom I adored. So, and he was an only child. And I just felt that it wouldn't be fair to them if we left the area. And I don't think my husband would have wanted to anyway. But but he did enjoy being here with me. All our vacations, all our holidays were out here. And he did enjoy the life, but it was he was someone who didn't grow up. We married very young, and he didn't grow up. He didn't want to give up his partying lifestyle. And he hated having to work so hard to support the family. And he was an unhappy man, and therefore I was an unhappy woman. If we could have worked it out, I would have liked it for my children, but it was clear to me, When he finally said to me, "We have to move back into an apartment. I don't want to pay for this house." And I had 2 little boys that needed the backyard more than they needed a house. And I said no. And I was also working, too, so that not full-time at that point, but I was working, and I just couldn't see how we could manage.
And had you thought at one point that you wanted to come back to the North Fork at that in-between?
Well, I was torn because I had a busy practice. I was working. I had 2 children who had a father in Massachusetts, and I think he would have given me a hard time if I did that. But I will tell you what happened. It was very interesting. When my father lost my mother, I was the one that was out here the most. Joe was still doing his thing. He wasn't, he was out here, but he was very helpful with my mother when she was ill and devastated by her death. And he really couldn't be there for my father the way my father needed someone to be there. So I was here. I'm dealing with a divorce. I got 2 young kids. I'm out here every weekend, right? At the end of summer. And the kids loved that. And they got to be with Joe because they didn't have their father. And they loved my father. So it was really good for them. But then he said to me, I want to give you, it was a family house out in Orient, at which my mother owned. And she inherited from her family. It was right across, it's on 25 across from Latham Farms in Orient. And so he said to me, "I'll let you have the house if you stay out here." And I looked at him, and first of all, the house was in terrible shape, and there was no way I could handle it. And the other thing was, if I stayed out there, then I'd be taking care of my father and my brother, the way my mother did, and I wasn't really up to that with 2 young children and wanting to work. So I said no. But I later met my second husband, and that was the best thing I ever did. And he loved it out here, too. So, but he was a prominent professor at Harvard. And when I talked about retiring out here, he said, "No Widener library out here." and no real access to a library. He worked till the day he died, doing research and writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he needed to be close to that world. And he was a wonderful stepfather to my kids, and it was a very healing marriage. So,
yes.
So I lived in Massachusetts, and I had a membership in a wonderful Unitarian Universalist church. My kids were doing well. And Bernard died in 2003. And I struggled along. It was hard because I had been severely injured in an automobile accident a year after I married my second husband. And I was functional, but I had a lot of pain. And I was always in PT, always exercising. And when he got sick and died, I realized taking care of a house and a yard was going to be terrifically hard for me. But I did it until Joe was diagnosed in 2016. And then I said, no, I had to move back here. In 1 month, I sold my practice, I sold my home, and I moved out here to be near him. And because he was really one of my closest family members. I still tear up when I talk about this.
Yeah.
So it's a very sad loss. And I was there for him. And I had worked in the field of community health as well as mental health. And I had cared for families whose relatives lived and died with ALS. And I was very invested in that work. And I knew what was going to happen. And I really knew how much he needed me to be here. So I did what I could do.
Yeah.
And it went on for 3 years. And when he died, I had to pick myself up and figure out how I was going to create a life out here because the village had changed a great deal. So,
that was 2000.
He died in 2019, August
2019.
23rd. Right. I came out in May of 2016. So it was 3 years. He was diagnosed. He had it for a while, but he was diagnosed in March of 2016, and I knew that his wife couldn't handle it. This is a terrible thing. It's a horrible illness to deal with. And he was 100 pounds heavier than me and a foot taller. And I learned how to use a Hoyer lift so I could transfer him because he needed so much care.
Yeah.
And it was very expensive to have nurses there. I was a little cheaper.
Could you talk about your brother, Joe Townsend, in terms of his time? Well, he went off to college and
BU also.
Yes.
Yeah, he was the top rower there. He that's where he really got into rowing. Yeah, he went off to college. We always were close. Always. Didn't matter where he was. We always, in the days of letter writing, we wrote letters to each other. Very unusual for siblings, but we did. And his dream after he rowed at the highest levels that he could row was to become a coach. And he was not going to live in Greenport. He was going to stay in Massachusetts. He'd gotten a job offered to him by Northeastern University. But they discovered that he and his teammates had gone on a strike against a terrible coach. They were number one in the country as freshmen oarsmen. And they brought in another coach for the next, and he was telling them to do all the things that they knew they should be doing. And they finally said they wouldn't row for him, so they went on. They boycotted him, and he lost a semester of rowing because of that. And then he lost his job at Northeastern because of that. They found that out, and that was not acceptable. So then my father wanted him to come to the business out here, so he came. He went into the business, and he realized right away there was nothing for him out here in terms of culture, friends. And so he decided to become the mayor and change the village.
He became the youngest mayor. And
ever
still
elected.
The
28. He had 2 terms.
Wow.
And when he loved government. He loved government, not politics. He hated politics. But he, so he was 2 years the mayor.
What's that time frame? Was that 70?
All right, he probably I have a hard time with that one. But I'm pretty sure my son was born in 70. I think he was still in Massachusetts in 70 And I think he lost it must have been like 73, 74. I think he came out here 75, 78. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he became the mayor in 78. So it was before. And then he had 2 terms. Mm-hmm. That's when Troy Gustafson came out here and met him. And at the end of his 2nd term, he had already gotten David Cabell to come out.
Yes.
So, because he wanted Dave to be part of this, getting the arts and culture out here, because David was the son of a very famous pianist. Mm-hmm. And knew a lot of people in the art world. But the other thing was he had many friends everywhere because he was such a gregarious guy. Many of them were artists and novelists, and he encouraged them to all come out here. Mm-hmm. He got grants to rebuild the historic district and started becoming a destination, which it never was in my day.
That was a turning point.
Joe's mayorship, when he started bringing people out here, he brought out artists, he brought out craftsmen. He brought out novelists and writers. Mm-hmm. They all, at the premiere of Ezra, the 2 people who headed that, the 2 Tonys, both talked about him and what he did to get them to come out here. And of course, once they got out here, the beauty of it and the fact that they were young and they really just worked very hard to attract tourism and what have you. Mm-hmm. I worked in the tourist business as a bus girl and a waitress, and it was very different than what it is now. Mm-hmm. There was Claudio's and Mitchell's and the Orient Point Inn. And I have a story about that, but you probably don't want to hear about that.
Did you work
at the Orient Point Inn?
At the Orient Point Inn?
Well, but the story I have about it is the man his name was Eugene O'Connell. He was an Irish immigrant that my grandfather met and hired him as his chauffeur because he was out all night long, doing deliveries and he couldn't drive safely. So Eugene became his chauffeur. And then his very close friend, because he was a very intelligent man, he was a pilot during World War I, and for the British, because he was from Ireland. Mm-hmm. And then he came over here, worked for my grandfather, and then he bought a place called Mount Pleasant House. And if you drive, with my grandfather's help, of course, you drive out Orient, as you're getting just off the causeway on the left-hand side, you'll see 2 pillars. Mm-hmm. One of them says Mount, and the other says Pleasant. And that's where the inn was. It was an inn. It burned down. So then my father helped Eugene use what insurance money he had to buy the Orient Point Inn. And and under his leadership, it became a very successful place. Mm-hmm. And then Arnold Mitchell bought it from him, of the Mitchell family that owned Mitchell's. Wasn't so successful. He was a bit of a drunk, but sad, because he was a nice guy, but he really had a severe problem. Yeah. Anyway, that's the Mount Pleasant House and the Orient Point Inn, and Eugene O'Donnell. And he actually was so close to the family that when my mother got married and her father was not alive, she asked him to give her away. And his grandson now is a plumber that I use in my... Wow. Yeah, it's these small world stuff.
Yeah. Now, did your brother say anything over his life about some of the changes within Greenport and what
he did.
He thought about it looking after later?
I'll tell you, there were certain things he told me about that I was very impressed. One was that during his mayorship, they were trying to get a terminal for the Crosstown Ferry where Mitchell Park is now. Mm-hmm. And he knew that would be the death of the village. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people like the idea of all the people coming in town and using, but somehow he persuaded them not to do that. He talked with me about that a lot. The other thing was he loved history, and he really wanted to restore a lot of historic places. Mm-hmm. And there was a beautiful building called the Clip House, which was on the grounds where the North Fork Trust Bank and the Capital One Bank are now. The hospital has a place there. That's where the Clip House was. And he couldn't stop it from being destroyed. He said he watched it crying as they tore it down. So that was something he talked a lot about. He did his best to save what historic things he could. He was very upset by the idea of the wealthy people coming and taking over. He was concerned that we were, that because we weren't as expensive as the East and the South Fork, that they would come here, and it has happened. He saw that happening. He was very pleased by the vineyards coming in. He knew that was going to be a real plus because truck farming was really on its way out, potato farming. Yeah. He loved the arts work that was going on. He bought the old village hall, which is on South Street, and he created galleries there. And it's still a gallery there. Yeah. He was thrilled by the people that he got to know, who were artists that he didn't know before they moved here. He loved Arden Scott was someone he really admired. He told me about all these people that he met. And I even heard about David Stockman, who was, with Reagan and he told me that when in a conversation with him that he felt that Reagan was going to destroy the economics of the country, even though he was because he wanted to spend less and reduce taxes. And so I had a long conversation with Joe about that. He moved from Greenport government to Southold Town, and he and Tom Wickham created the special, Southold, it was a third party. And I'm just blocking, I know what it is. Anyway, but they had a great friendship and worked hard together. They beat the Republicans for the first time in the history of politics out here. Yeah. And it was a shock to the Republicans because they didn't think they had a chance. They figured but they won. And they did some good things. Joe got involved in saving properties, creating there's a little park on the corner of Young's Avenue and 25 with a gazebo. That was a house that burned down, and they wanted to create another big store. And Joe said, "No, let's make a park." And they could do it because they were in charge of the government at that time. Yeah. He ran again, and of course, at this point, the Republicans knew they were in trouble, so they did a vicious campaign, all kinds of horrible things. And Joe couldn't stand that. He said, "I'm never running again." He got on planning boards, lots of town projects, and did all these research, all this history about the town, and then the Republicans decided that they wanted to appoint someone else because he was not a Republican. But so the Southold Town supervisor, I don't know whether might have been Scott Russell, I don't know, but said to him, "Well, Joe, you've done so much work for us. Can we have all your research?" And he said, "No. It's mine. You want me to help you? I'll keep you on the board. And if you don't, I'm gone." And they didn't want that as much as they wanted one of their cronies. Yeah. He was very hurt by that. He had worked very hard. Yeah. All kinds of proposals and policies he created. Wow. Yeah.
That was in the 80s.
That was later than that, probably 90s.
Into the 90s.
It could have been late 80s. Yeah. But he was on. He then he did the business with he joined the Laconic Land Trust. Did a lot of work with them. He used to commute over there once a week to meet with them. He's very close to the men who were running it, and he was instrumental in helping to conserve a lot of land on the North Fork. Because he was the one who was on the North Fork, not the other people were on the South Fork. And he saved Edwards Farm, which is a farmland pretty much a short distance from the ferry, from the point. And so they have a memorial to him there. It's the Edwards Farm runs all the way out to the Calyx Bay, and they have a beautiful plaque to him and bench. And the reason they chose to put it there was because when he was rowing for practicing rowing for the Olympics, he rowed in Calyx Bay. Yeah. And
then he stayed out here the rest of his life.
He loved it out here. I mean, he traveled with his wife and child. I mean, he did, but he initially it was so hard because he went into business with my father. He had a tiny salary. He had no money. And he figured it right away he had to do some investment with real estate if he was going to be able to stay here. So he bought a lot of investment properties, and he was a terrific landlord. He really helped people, just like my mom. And he worked with the North Fork Housing Alliance so that he could get subsidized housing for people. And he tried,
I mean, he started to see a rise in popularity for the North Fork and a rise in...
He wasn't... Interesting. He did this so he could rent properties to locals. He didn't rent to... He did not rent to people who...
It wasn't for, like, tourists coming out in the
Driftwood Cove, he bought a lot of houses on 2nd Street, refurbished them, rented them. Affordable housing. He believed in affordable housing. Mm-hmm. We had one tenant that got into trouble with drugs, and he stopped paying rent. And Joe was really concerned when we had the building across the way from Long Island Hospital. Mm-hmm. And it turns out this guy was dealing drugs on the hospital parking lot where there was a treatment center. So Joe took the bull by the horn and said to him, "You owe me 3 months' rent. If you don't want to pay me 3 months' rent, get out now, and you don't have to pay me." And he left right away. It was the smartest thing he could do. We were gonna. It was sad because he was a young kid. Joe was trying to give a chance to,
Yeah.
But he did a lot for a lot of people out here. And if he had Section 8 housing and they couldn't afford their rent, their piece of the rent, he understood. He took the rent from the government, and he gave them a pass until they could pay. However, it got to be known that he did this, and then all of a sudden he was getting in a little bit of trouble because he really didn't vet them very well. So he learned that the only mistake he made after some issues was letting this kid come in with his girlfriend and son. That was a big mistake. And he recognized that he didn't really know who he was. He'd talked with his employer, who said he was a wonderful kid, worked hard, but no one mentioned the fact that he had a history with drugs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but he was a very kind, and
it could even be looked at, people might disagree, but more of a humane.
He was very humane. Very humane.
Whereas not as cutthroat with every single thing, whereas you get...
He looked at the whole picture. Mm-hmm. He had a wonderful couple with 2 young children, and the man became a paraplegic from the neck down. His wife worked very hard to support the family. Her parents came in to help. The neighbors around didn't like the fact that there were 2 more people living in there. And he would say to them, "It's not really your business, it's mine. I'm the landlord." Mm-hmm. And then when she was able to put aside some money because she couldn't pay, he worked out the deal with her that she paid only so much of what she owed, so she could save money to buy a house and have it handicapped access. Mm-hmm. She did it, and he helped her.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, I mean, you said when you came back out, had you been visiting all the time throughout, even through the 70s, 80s, 90s, always. 2000s,
always.
Before you officially moved back in 2000?
We had the family house to 2004. Mm-hmm. So I had a place to go to. Yeah. Big enough to take my kids, my second husband, his daughter, her child and husband. We could all be together. Mm-hmm.
What did you think of the area after you had moved back here?
Well, first of all, I went back and looked at my old yearbook, and in it they asked me what was my pet peeve, and I said Greenport. And I thought to myself, I had a reunion. I think it was our 40, maybe 55th reunion out here after I moved here. And they kept saying, "How could you not like this place?" Because everybody, I said, "I'm not planning anything. All you people have to go to the village. You'll find things to do." And they did. And I loved that part of Greenport, that it was so vibrant and alive. I'm not big into shopping and things like that, but young people are, other people are. It's a beautiful village with all the historical buildings, with all the work that's been done. It's really remarkable. Mm-hmm. And but do I go to the village on the weekends in the summer? Mm-mm. Mm-hmm. My mother never did, even years ago. She died 45 years ago.
And she wouldn't go then?
Not during then. She looked forward to Labor Day because it was so crowded. She would not have been able to deal with the fact that it goes down through Thanksgiving.
Yes.
But it is quieter. It's not the same as the Heights.
Yeah.
I love Greenport. I think it's I'm very sad about what's happened to the housing here. Because when I grew up, we were always outside playing on our bikes, and we knew everybody, and there were all the houses that are now second homes were family homes with children and just, you don't see kids out on the streets anymore. You don't see them playing anymore. I suppose it's dangerous, with all the traffic being what it is.
Yeah.
But, we had pickup softball games on the side of our yard. Every kid in the neighborhood came to play with us. We created bases we found the bottom of pillars in the garage that had been when they changed the pillars on the house, they left the base, so they were our bases. We put them in the ground.
Yeah.
We had our own rules. It was that kind of thing that you don't see anymore. You go down 2nd Street, you see the kids or 3rd Street, you see the kids playing outside. They have basketball, and they have the
basketball
park,
court,
and they have the but
it's not the same.
Well, they're not. The families aren't here year round. The ones that have summer homes with kids are only here during the summer.
Yeah, and it's even quieter in the winter time because a lot of those families go. Yeah.
It was pretty quiet even because we did have a tourist industry here at one time. It wasn't, people didn't buy out homes, but they stayed in the motels. Soundview has been here since the 60s. They stayed in motels. It didn't cost $750 a night in those days.
Yeah.
There were other motels. People would come out. The Townsend Manor was always popular, always busy. Yeah. But different, it's a different intensity now. But there is definitely, there is always a definite quietude growing up here. It was like the desert when you're a kid,
Yeah. And you said you have the thing that you said when you were in high school that about Greenport then.
Yeah.
But just looking back now, do you miss anything about the way some things used to be?
What I really miss are the families that live out here, seeing the children. I think it's a travesty. A travesty that people can't afford to live here anymore. I loved always associating with across the board socioeconomic people.
Now it's changing to just more
wealthy
upper class, and that's
it. Not even middle or working class anymore.
No, the middle class is kind of disappearing.
No, but you can't see a home for sale in Greenport for less than $900,000. Most of them are $1 million. There's one on Carpenter Street, which was the slum of the town when I was growing up, and it's over $1 million for a loft. Must be a 2nd floor. I thought to myself, oh my God, there were lots of families that lived down there.
Yeah,
and lots of wonderful kids. So many of my friends have left. Of course, now they're not alive anymore because I'm quite old. But so many of my friends left long before these changes because it wasn't a viable lifestyle for them. There are people now who close their businesses because they can't hire workers because there's no housing for them. That really bothers me. I'm involved with a lot of stuff out here now. My church, my condo association, which I'm going to get off of because it's too much, but and the North Fork Unity Action Council. And we're responsible for getting Sonia Spar hired by the town. We worked hard for that one.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you mentioned housing and families. Were there any other important, or what other issues do you think are important that are facing Greenport?
Climate change, big time out here. The
winters aren't the same as
there's no snow.
Snow, yeah.
I don't mind that so much because I lived in Massachusetts, but there's no snow where I live in Massachusetts.
That's not the same anymore either.
No, but those were severe. I remember 6 feet in my backyard till April in Massachusetts. I remember snow and ice out here. Joe used to ice boat here. They haven't been able to ice boat for several years now.
Yeah.
It's because the bays don't freeze over anymore. I remember walking down the sound and seeing the ice, along the, going out so far. Of course, because of the action of the waves, it broke up, but it was cold enough for the sound to freeze. And I have pictures of my sister skating on Sterling Creek.
Wow.
And my father told us stories of driving the car from Greenport to Shelter Island over the ice.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's many years ago.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, but the thing that I notice is, I go down to the beach where my mother used to take us for long walks, and the beach is smaller now. It's tide's high, the water comes over. But after a storm, the beach is right up to the bluff. There's no beach. My brother's home is in East Marion, and when the high tide comes in, now it covers the whole end of his beach that he had there, the point that went out. It's covered. I mean, when I was taking care of him, I'd sit and look at these storms and I'd see what was happening. I said to myself, this house isn't going to be here forever. And it's a gorgeous place, but it's not going to be here for, the water comes so high now.
Yeah, the high tides and then erosion.
He had to move his utilities from his cellar up to a second floor because he was out of the house more than he was in the house, given the fact that all this stuff would flood.
Yeah. Yeah, that's happening a lot with a lot of houses nowadays.
Yeah.
They can't use the basement anymore.
No. Oh, his is always filled. He said to me, when he didn't have a chance to do it, that he should have filled it with sand to lower his taxes.
Yeah.
But he didn't.
Oh, and then just looking back over your years, how did growing up in Greenport shape the person you are today?
Oh, it did a lot. I mean, I love being back here because I don't have to dress up. I was working as a professional in Massachusetts. When I married my husband, who was a prominent professor, I had to dress up. Now I live a casual life. I always loved the freedom of movement out here. I never could enjoy my life in Massachusetts the way I could out here because there's much more traffic, much more constriction. Everybody needed to be, I'm still very, I guess, type A, but I can really relax when I'm out here. And that gave me a core of casualness that has gotten me through life. Because I've had a lot of casualties in my life. So be able to find a place where I can really unwind and be myself. I mean, this is who I was growing up out here.
Yes.
Yeah. Not the professional social worker, wife of, prominent Harvard professor. I mean, I like the intellectual, that stuff I really loved a lot, but
it's this is coming back to your
roots.
Yeah.
It's been a shock to me in some ways because I thought I remembered the village so well. And I realized so much had changed. I've been here, but I'd never been a part of it.
Yeah.
And Joe, I was so sad when I lost the ability to converse with him about all the questions I had about the changes, because he really knew everything.
Yeah.
But, last part of his life, he could hardly talk, and he managed, but...
Yeah. Now, we've been talking about some of the changes in Greenport and issues, but just looking to the future, what do you hope for the North Fork and its community down the line?
Oh, what I hope for and what's possible, I'm not sure the same.
If it's possible to happen.
The inequity of wealth throughout the whole country is very, very apparent here. And it makes me very sad. There's a loss of trying to recognizing that we need to share what we have, and that we can't put people down because they haven't been able to achieve what we've been able to achieve. They should be able to live a secure life, and it's happening all over the world, but over the country, where there's so many billionaires and there's so many impoverished children. How do we bring that into a better ratio?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm going to say it's much more obvious to me here because I see the whole community. It's not so obvious when you live in the Boston area because, I know a lot of poverty in the Boston area, terrible poverty, horrible segregation in the schools. They've just found out, the kids are worse off than they were before the busing. But I lived in a small city at the end, and I just didn't see it the same way. Mm-hmm. I felt it, but I didn't see it. Here I see it and feel it. So it's a double whammy.
Yeah.
How do we change it? Education. The level of education is pretty good out here, mm-hmm. but a lot of people get lost.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of closing the gap,
yeah,
that some of that comes down to people not being as greedy with in terms of wealth, sharing, and
I mean, I'm not a wealthy woman, but I think nothing of sharing. Mm-hmm. If someone needs something, I wish I could do it. I mean, part of being part of an advocacy group is that I'd like to change the way things are, mm-hmm. so that people just automatically know that they can be secure. Mm-hmm. And I learned early on when I was working in social work in a settlement house that people really want to work. They just don't have the opportunity. Mm-hmm. Some of them get sick and go into drugs and alcohol, but most people want to work. Mm-hmm. It's part of who we are as human beings. They don't have the opportunity, or they get into drugs or alcohol. It's not because they want to. I have a friend mm-hmm. who said, "Who wants to wake up and say, I want to be an alcoholic or an addict?" Mm-hmm. Nobody does. Mm-hmm. And it's always been an issue that, very wealthy think, well, they got it because they worked, and the others don't deserve it because they didn't work. Mm-hmm. They don't look at the fact that they didn't have the opportunity.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. No, and then just lastly, I asked if there's anything else last things you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't talked about.
Oh, I don't think so. I don't have a problem talking, as you can tell. Well, I guess I should say that one of the most wonderful aspects of my being back here is being part of the First Universalist Church and the rebuilding. Mm-hmm. We are all working so hard, but it's very exciting.
Yes.
And we desperately need help from the community in terms of joining us and working with us, and also supporting our rebuilding effort. Mm-hmm. But it's a wonderful community. Mm-hmm. When I was in Massachusetts, I was a part of a Unitarian Universalist church that basically helped me get through my divorce and mm-hmm. created a world for my children where they felt loved and respected. And I just think there's so much to be offered by having the First Universalist Church here in Southold. So I'm working hard.
Yes. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and really tell your fascinating story about your family. It was wonderful to hear, and your career as a social worker and all the wonderful work you're doing for the community and continue to do on the North Fork. So I really want to thank you so much.
As you grow older, the most important thing you have in your life, if you want to age well, is to lead a meaningful life. And I've been able to do that out here, which mm-hmm. is making me very happy.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 78 with Susan Townsend Johnson. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.